Bore da, pawb, a chroeso cynnes i gynhadledd Headway UK a Gwasanaeth Anafiadau Ymennydd Gogledd Cymru 2023. Good morning all and a warm welcome to Headway UK and the North Wales Brain Injury Service Virtual Conference 2023. Following on from our event last year, Life After Brain Injury, Living with a Hidden Disability, I am pleased to welcome you back to this year's conference titled Navigating Life After Brain Injury, a conference to celebrate 25 years of collaboration between Headway and the North Wales Brain Injury Service, in collaboration with Betty Cadwaladr's University Health Board's North Wales Brain Injury Service, again to reflect what has become a mature partnership. I'm Fionn Jones, Headway UK's Network Support Coordinator, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's conference that promises to be full of interesting and thoughtful presentations from Headway UK, experts by experience, clinical psychologists and academics working in community brain injury rehab in North Wales. I'm especially pleased to welcome a panel of experts giving their time freely who will explore the subject with us from several angles. I'd like to welcome Dr. Rudy Coitzer, Margaret Morby, Dr. Catherine Roberts, Cheryl Torkinson and Tamsin Keys. A welcome and a big thank you to our conference chair, Sophie, who will guide us through the morning and keep us to time as the programme unfolds. My thanks to you all for giving your time and for sharing your knowledge with us today. Today's event would not have been possible without the support of Slater and Gordon lawyers who from the outset have once again committed the time of marketing and event staff who have helped me with the administration of the conference. And also a thank you to Darren Hughes from Slater and Gordon for making this happen. Mwynhewch y dydd, enjoy the day, and over to you, Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fionn. Okay, so bore da, good morning, croeso pawb. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. So my name is Dr. Sophie Perry. I'm a principal clinical psychologist at the North Wales Brain Injury Service. I work as part of the community neurorehabilitation team, and I am the clinical lead for our new neuronavigation service, which you will hear more about later. It is my great pleasure to be chairing this conference today. So as Fionn had mentioned, this conference is organised by a small group of people with personal experience of brain injury alongside Headway and colleagues from the North Wales Brain Injury Service. It is a conference designed for people with a brain injury, their family and friends. It is also great to see that so many professionals and students have also joined us today. So as Fionn said, the title of today's conference is Navigating Life After Brain Injury. We have worked with Headway, producing this conference for many years now, but this year is a particularly special year as it marks the 25th year of collaboration between the Brain Injury Service and Headway. As many of you will know from personal experience, the journey after brain injury, from those early days in hospital and the months and years that follow, can be confusing and difficult to navigate. Consequences can be lifelong, can involve complex changes to thinking abilities, behaviour and emotions, and are often invisible to others. This can make it particularly difficult to make sense of these changes, which often have a significant impact on many aspects of the person's life. In my own clinical work, I have had the absolute privilege of working with families affected by brain injury right from those early days in hospital through specialist inpatient neurorehabilitation and later returning back to their own community. I have witnessed firsthand the challenges that the person with a brain injury and the people around them face when trying to process what is usually a sudden and life-changing injury. Alongside this, families are suddenly expected to be thrown into a world of neurorehabilitation and different facilities that most have had no experience or training to understand. This is part of the reason why we have secured funds for our new neuronavigation team, and Cheryl will share more with you about this later on. We wanted this conference to be an opportunity to hear the voices and to learn from people with personal experience of brain injury. We are lucky to have Margaret Morby with us today, who is a mother of someone with a brain injury, who is going to share her family experience of navigating life after brain injury. She is speaking alongside Dr. Catherine Roberts, consultant clinical neuropsychologist and clinical lead for the community neurorehabilitation team here in North Wales. We will also have the great opportunity to hear about current research in the area and the recent work that Headway have produced, as well as more about the development of neuronavigation in North Wales. Okay, so my job today will be to try to keep us to time, and I am hoping we will have the opportunity to take some questions after each talk. Now, I appreciate that the original agenda that's gone out to everybody, we've had to make a last minute change. So Dr. Rudy Koitzer was due to speak first, but due to some technical issues, Tamsin has very kindly agreed to step up, and Rudy will be speaking with us later on. So I would like to welcome Tamsin Keys. Tamsin is the Publications and Research Manager at Headway, and she is going to be talking about the hugely important topic of changes in identity after brain injury. I'll pass over to you, Tamsin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Let me just see if I can share my screen. We have practiced this, so with a bit of luck. Is everybody able to see that okay? Would somebody just mind shouting up, because I can't see anybody's faces now?
Yes, it's fine, Tamsin.
Yeah, perfect, lovely. All right. Thank you again, Sophie, for that introduction. My name is Tamsin Keys, and I am the Publications and Research Manager at Headway UK. And as has already been mentioned, I will be talking today about identity change after brain injury, and specifically within the context of some work that we did at Headway UK a number of years ago through a campaign called A New Me. So seeing as I'm talking about identity today, I wanted to begin, if I may, with a brief introduction to my identity. So as you've already heard a few times, I am the Publications and Research Manager at Headway UK. That's the formal introduction to my identity. I am a psychologist by background. I am a keen gardener. These are some of the roses from my garden, which I'm very proud of. I am an amateur historian and an even more amateur philosopher. And if it wasn't already obvious by now, I'm also somewhat of a bookworm. I am a wife to this cheeky chap, and I am a mother to this even more cheeky little girl. And as I'm reflecting on these aspects of my identity, I'd like everybody to just take a moment to think about your identities. If somebody came to you and said, complete the following sentence, I am a ... what would you say? So these are some of the things that I would say about my identity. And the reason this particular picture is so big on the screen is that for me, when I became a mother, it was a moment in my life where I felt like a new me, a new sense in my identity, as I'm sure any parent in the audience will also testify to. So that's a moment in my life where I felt like a new person, and it's a very natural and normal part of life to change and to feel like new people and to feel like we're discovering new identities. None of us feel like we're the same person as we were when we were 5 years old, or maybe as a teenager, or even a year ago, or maybe even pre-pandemic, which seems to be quite a key milestone for a lot of people nowadays. So change is very normal. It's a natural reaction to the life changes that we all go through. And when it's within our control and when it's something that we're expecting, it can be relatively easy to adjust to and accept to that. But when things happen very unexpectedly or very out of the blue, or they're very drastic or dramatic, that can be incredibly difficult for us to then adjust our change in identity to. For instance, when a sudden injury or a sudden accident occurs and somebody sustains a brain injury through that, or a sudden unexpected diagnosis of a brain injury comes out of the blue. These are some situations that can be incredibly difficult to then adjust to that sense of identity change. Now, my first introduction to the world of brain injury was through the work of the famous neurologist, Dr. Oliver Sacks. Some of you may know him as the author of the very famous book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which is an excellent collection of case studies for people with various neurological conditions. But I just wanted to share a quote from Dr. Sacks that I think is a really nice summary of identity. Now, I know people don't like it when you read off a screen, so I promise this is the only time that I will do this in my presentation. But just to kind of guide you through this quote a little bit. So if we wish to know about a man, we must ask, what is his story, his real inmost story? For each of us is a biography, a story. Each of us is a singular narrative which is constructed continually, unconsciously, by, through, and is us. Through our perceptions, our feelings, our thoughts, our actions, and not least our discourse, our spoken narrations. Biologically, physiologically, we are not so different from each other. Historically, as narratives, we are each of us unique. We're all of us unique. We are all different. We all have our independent traits and our independent qualities. And of course, it's the same for brain injury survivors as well. And this is something that we often say, that no two brain injuries are ever the same. Everybody's experience is very different. But one of the things that I've noticed, certainly, time and time again in the 10 years that I've worked in the field of brain injury, not just within Headway UK, but also through neurorehabilitation, is this constant theme of identity change, this sense of feeling like a new person after brain injury, that life is a new life, that life has changed. And this seems to be almost a universal thing that people report. So because it's so common, we at Headway UK a number of years ago launched a campaign called A New Me. And this was all about this concept of identity change after brain injury. We did this campaign as part of Action for Brain Injury Week, which many of you will be familiar with, but for those who don't know, this is a campaign week that we hold every year in May, where we aim to raise awareness of a topic that's of particular resonance and importance to the brain injury community. And as part of this A New Me campaign, we produced a number of resources such as videos, creative works that were collated from brain injury survivors, podcast episodes and articles. And also as part of that campaign, we conducted a survey, which is what I will be focusing on today. And the reason we do surveys is that it allows us to get some very rich and insightful data about the experiences of people on the particular topic. And when we announced the topic and the theme for that particular ABI week, we actually got what was the highest number of responses to date to any survey that we had done up until that point. And that was 862 responses, which to us was a huge testament to the fact that this particular topic was really resonating with the brain injury community, and that a lot of people wanted to give their voice to this particular campaign, which was brilliant. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to go through the details of the survey and the report today, but it is all available online if you wish to follow it up. So I will just be talking about some of the more salient points. And just for the demographics, I want to focus on the fact that we captured how long ago somebody's brain injury was. And as you can see on the screen, there was quite a spread of time length since people had sustained their injuries. And that was great because this allowed us to look at whether the length of time since somebody's injury had any impact on their attitude to the sense of identity change after brain injury. So the first thing we did was we asked people to rate how strongly they agreed or disagreed with a number of statements. And the first statement that we asked people to rate was, I feel like I am a new person after my brain injury. So that's a very broad statement, but it allowed us to actually quantify how much people do connect with this sense of feeling like a new person. You know, we know from anecdotal evidence that a lot of people say that they do feel like a new person, but this allowed us to actually look at the numbers. And what we found was that just under 3/4 of people agreed. Specifically within that, it was about 45% of people that strongly agreed. So that's about half of those 860 odd people that strongly felt like they were a new person after their brain injury. About 15% disagreed and 10% felt neutral about this particular statement. And when we factored time into it, what we found was that in the first 6 months or so of injury, only about half of the people felt like they were a new person. And in this very early stage, people might still be in hospital, they might be undergoing a period of rehabilitation, they might have very recently been discharged back home, or indeed they might not have been into hospital at all, but it's a very early time point within the first 6 months of brain injury. And at that point, many people don't recognise that there is going to be a potentially long-term impact of brain injury. We tend to hear a lot of questions like, when will I go back to my old self? And, I just want my life to get back to how it was. So at this point, I think people sometimes do feel like they don't necessarily understand what the longer term impact of the injury might be. When it gets to about that 1 year time point, we massively see that increasing to 82% of people that feel like they are a new person. And then consistently, we have about 77% of people that feel like they're a new person, all the way through to 20 years, at which point we see it drop a little bit again. And I think that's an incredibly powerful graph and an incredibly powerful set of figures, because it shows that people are comparing their current self to their pre-injury self, not just 1 year down the line or 2 years down the line, but 5 years, 10 years, even after 20 years, people are still thinking about who they are now, but comparing it to who they were 20 years ago. So that really goes to show that long-term impact of brain injury, I think. If we all just sort of take a moment to think about who we are today and imagine ourselves in 20 years' time, that's such a long time to be comparing a pre and post self. So I think that really does go to highlight the long-term impact of brain injury. The next statement that we then asked people to rate was, I acknowledge the anniversary of my brain injury. So as human beings, it's natural for us to reflect on key events in our lives, and anniversaries tend to be a really core moment that we naturally tend to reflect on. So that's why we asked about anniversaries. About 62% of people agreed that they acknowledged the anniversary of their injury, 21% disagreed, and 17% felt neutral. So a bit more of a spread of people's approaches. But that, again, majority of people did acknowledge their anniversary. And when we looked at the responses to this question as well, what we found was a mix in people's attitudes towards their anniversary. So as can be expected, some people felt quite negatively when they come up to the anniversary. They feel quite upset. So for this particular person, I cry for the woman that I was, the children that I haven't been able to have, the loss of my career. Now, that's a really important quote there, because we often talk about the loss of the life that people had before their injury, or the loss of memories, or the loss of things that they enjoyed doing, or skills that they had. But maybe what we don't talk about as much is the loss of opportunities and the loss of aspirations and dreams and goals. All of us have dreams and goals and aspirations, and that's what keeps us going, and that's what keeps us driven and moving forwards. And for many of us, those are very long-term goals that we have. So for that to suddenly change for people can be incredibly difficult, and to lose that sense of something that somebody has worked towards or something that somebody has dreamed of is something we maybe don't talk about as much in brain injury. Another important quote, I leave flowers at the crash location and ask why. So this particular person is describing something that's almost traditionally associated with a bereavement and a loss of somebody. Some people had quite positive approaches to their anniversary. So this person says, I never would have become a trauma therapist if I did not have my own story to tell. Every year on my anniversary, I go out and celebrate it as a new birthday, as I can't remember my birthdays before my accident. Now, this is a really interesting one, because when we looked at the responses to this particular question, we found that time and time again, this word birthday was coming up. And it came up so often that we looked at quantifying it, and we found that 1 in 10 people were actually acknowledging their anniversary as a new birthday, and celebrating their anniversary as a new birthday. And I think if we directly compare that quote to the second quote on the screen, that I leave flowers at the crash location, we can see how different people's experiences and attitudes are. on the one hand, we have someone talking about it as celebrating a new birthday, which is a very happy occasion. And on the other hand, you have somebody describing something like a bereavement and a loss, and grieving, which we do often hear people talk about, grieving for their sense of self, grieving for the person that they were. So I think, if anything, this just goes to show the diversity in people's responses and their feelings and their attitudes towards their brain injury. I think that's a really stark comparison that I just wanted to highlight there. When we looked at time again and factored that into it, we found that it was really the first year anniversary that many people, the majority of people, were acknowledging, which is unsurprising potentially, because first year anniversaries do tend to be the most significant ones. But again, we find that that continues over the years, so that even after 20 years, about half of the respondents to our survey were still acknowledging their anniversary. So again, another demonstration of the long-term impact of brain injury, and just goes to show how important a life event that is for many people. The next statement that we asked people to rate was, "I have had to accept that I will never be the person I once was." Now, it's one thing to feel like you're a different person and to say that you feel like you're a different person, but it's another thing to feel like you have to accept that fact. And acceptance is something that comes with a lot of psychological work before you come to the stage of accepting something. When we talk about models of grief, for instance, we talk about depression, anger, bargaining, denial, and then finally we get to this stage of acceptance. And that's not a linear process. People can go back and forth and go through different stages. So there's a lot to work through before somebody comes to accept something in their lives. So 87% of people agreed with that statement, 9% disagreed, and 6% felt neutral. So the majority of people felt like they had to accept that this had happened and that they will be a different person moving forwards. And again, when we factored time into it, it was really that point after about a year where people start to come to accept that life has changed and that things are going to be different now. And as we can expect, year on year, as the person starts recognizing that this is what life is going to be like, that level of acceptance continues. But what we see is after 20 years, similar to the other graphs, is that after 20 years, that drops a little bit. So possibly what we're seeing is that 20 years down the line, people are so adjusted to their sense of self that even though they're thinking about the fact that they've changed, they've also accepted that they are a new person, and that feels like normality for them now, so that they're not necessarily comparing it to who they were before. So moving on from the statements a little bit, we then asked about aspects of life and whether people felt like certain aspects of their life had improved or worsened since their brain injury. Now, unfortunately, as we know from anecdotal evidence and from across the literature, that the majority of people feel that many different aspects of their life do get worse after brain injury, but we wanted to look at that in detail. And unfortunately, as you can see, that is what we found as well. The blue bars are people saying that these aspects of life have gotten worse, whereas the orange ones are better, and grey is not changed. So by and large, people felt like all of these different domains of life had worsened. And I think also, just to make the point as well, we talk a lot about the effects of brain injury, but we know that it has a much wider impact on so many different aspects of life. And again, I think this just goes to show how permeating the nature of brain injury can be, that all of these different domains can be negatively affected. But what I would like to also focus on from this chart, which is very interesting, is that about 20% of people felt like their self-esteem and their home life had gotten better. And I will talk about that in a bit more detail shortly, and some of the reasons why that might be the case. We then asked a very open question of, what does a new me mean to you? So obviously, us as a communications team at Headway UK, we came up with this campaign title because we felt that it encapsulated this sense of identity change, but we wanted to know, was that also carrying the same meaning for our communities? And also, what does a sense of identity change mean to people? Because we know that identity is very subjective. We all have different measures of our identity. We all think about different things when we reflect on our identities. So we wanted to capture some of that subjective nature. And as could be expected, we had some people that felt very positively about their new sense of self, some people that felt quite upset about their new sense of self, and then some people who had a mixture of both emotions. That final face on the screen is supposed to be the mixed emotions, but to me it looks a little bit stern, but it's supposed to be both. So just focusing on some of the positive attitudes that people shared then, I much prefer the new me now. I'm more empathetic and take things slowly too. And now I do mindfulness. More time with family and friends, better quality of life. And an improved me, someone who appreciates life and loved ones and seeks to help others and give back, and being grateful for opportunities. So some of these quotes are touching on something called post-traumatic growth, which is this ability that after a traumatic incident, people can develop feelings of resilience and renewed appreciation of life and renewed appreciation of their loved ones, looking for chances to give back to the community and support other people. So this is all wrapped up in post-traumatic growth, and we can see some of those themes coming out in these quotes. Also, what seemed to be quite connected to this is this, again, concept of acceptance. So accepting that things have changed seems to be quite linked to feeling positively about being a new person. And with acceptance, we're talking about different things. So accepting all the changes that a brain injury can bring to people's lives, or accepting that things have happened as they are and we cannot go back, we cannot change what's happened, and we just have to move forwards from that. Accepting all of the limitations that a brain injury can bring and learning to adapt and learning to implement strategies, and accepting that you need to start relying on strategies. All of these are wrapped up again with that concept of acceptance. Some of the quotes of people feeling sad about their new sense of self. So I used to work, study, all of this is gone. I feel different, not just within myself, but near other people, slower and can't keep up and do the things that I used to do. A lonely person who is unable to do the things he used to do. Now, some of these quotes link back to socializing. And if we think back to that bar chart, which I showed earlier, social life was actually the highest blue bar, so the most worsened aspect of life that people felt had been affected by brain injury. And we are social creatures as human beings. We need social networks. We rely on other people for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons is also that it gives us a sense of our identity, to know where we fit in with the world, what group of people we fit in with. It helps us to reflect on what our values are and what we want to work towards, what our goals are. All of these things can also come from our socializing opportunities. So linking that then with identity is, if people feel like they are not socially connected with others, and if they're starting to feel lonely, this can also then have an impact on their identity and figuring out where they fit in with the world. And there's that stern face, but again, people's mixed attitudes, not being able to do things, but finding new things, still learning who the new me is. Sometimes I like her, sometimes I don't. From the outside, no different, however, less confident. Positives, though, are finding joy in the little things and appreciating life. So again, we talked about some of the processes that underpin acceptance and moving on and nurturing some post-traumatic growth. So maybe there are people that are on that journey and on that process through these quotes. Just a couple of reflections then from what I've shared so far. Now, I know that many of you, all of you, will have some connection to brain injury or some interest in brain injury. So possibly some of what I've shared today hasn't necessarily been groundbreaking or new information. However, what I hope it has done has highlighted a topic that we don't often talk about, and that's identity after brain injury. There's a really big focus on things in rehabilitation, on things such as speech and language therapy, physiotherapy, medication, cognition. But when we put all of those pieces together, and at the heart of all of that is a person with an identity.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We've just got 1 minute, okay?
Oh, sorry. I will wrap up as quickly as I can.
Thank
so
you.
A person with sort of aspirations and goals and things that they want to achieve in life. So I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of that at the heart of it all is a person with an identity. I'm going to skip forward a little bit, but just some final take-home messages to reflect on my slides. Many survivors will acknowledge the anniversary of their injury. So if you know that somebody is coming up to the anniversary, just take a bit of time to talk to them, find out how they're feeling, be sensitive to the fact that they might be quite upset or they might be reflecting on that. Acceptance can improve over time. We've talked about that in a bit of detail. There is a very long-term nature of brain injury, and I hope that some of the data I've shared today has illustrated that. Identity is historical narratives. This goes back to that Oliver Sacks quote that people like to tell their stories, they like to reflect on what they've been through, and that can sometimes help with identity reconstruction. So let people share their stories if they want to. We've talked about post-traumatic growth. We've talked about the impact on social life. I'm trying to whiz through now. And I am many things. So at the beginning of this presentation, I reflected on the various aspects of my identity. I encouraged you all to do the same. And it's really important not to lose sight of the fact that brain injury survivors are also many things. We use labels like brain injury survivor, client, service user, patient, but they are many things as well. And sometimes it's really important to be able to focus on some of those other aspects of people's identities and nurture them and channel them as best as we can. Just a very quick mention that we do have a couple of downloadable resources on our website that talk about these topics in much greater detail. So please do feel free to check those out. And I did have a video that I was going to share. It's a very short one, but I don't know if we have time. Can anybody confirm whether we have, I think it's about 2-3 minutes long.
I'm really sorry, Tamsin. We're
That's
out
okay.
of time now, but thank you
No,
so
not at all. Not at all. The video is available on our website for anybody who wants to watch it, or just get in touch with me and I can send it by email. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Tamsin, and I'm sorry for cutting you short. But that was a fascinating talk, and I think you just raised some really important issues there that we certainly, I know in my own clinical role, that are issues that we talk about frequently. So thank you so much. And like you said, on the Headway website, you can access the video you mentioned and those booklets. And I'm sure we don't have any time for questions, but I'm sure, Tamsin, you'd be happy if anybody has any burning questions there'll be contact details at the end that they can send them through. And I'm sure you do your best to try and answer them.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you again, everybody, for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tamsin. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt, Sophie. Is there a name for the video that I can just type in the chat box and then everyone can access that?
Yes, so it's 10 things not to say to somebody with a brain injury. If you like, I can find it and I'll pop that in because I should be able to easily access it.
Because we've had a slight change in the order with which the presenters are talking today, we're going to take the opportunity to have a break now at 11 o'clock because we know how important it is for all of us to get away from our screens for a little while. So we will meet back at 11:15 for our next presenter. Thank you ever so much, everybody. To start off the second half of the conference this morning, it is my pleasure to introduce you to my colleague, Cheryl Talkington, who is the first neuronavigator in North Wales. She started her post earlier this year and has very kindly agreed to share with you some of her experience so far. Cheryl has done a fantastic job stepping into not only a new role for her, but a completely new service within North Wales, and not to mention agreeing to present it to all of us today. She has worked tirelessly with me to shape and develop this service, which is still very much in its infancy. But I will now pass you over to Cheryl to introduce us to neuronavigation within North Wales. Are you there, Cheryl?
I'd like to say receiving you loud and clear. Thank you,
Sophie.
We
can hear you loud and clear as well.
Brilliant. Okay, right then. So my kind of role today is to introduce myself. So as we said, I am Cheryl Talkington, and I have the privilege of holding the role of being the first neuronavigator for North Wales. So I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank Sophie and Headway and everyone here for inviting me to speak today to share a little bit more information about the role. So now I'm going to try, I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully with the magic of technology, I'm going to be able to share some slides with you about the role. So if you could just bear with me a moment. Okay. Let me just. Okay. Let's see if this works. Okay. There we go.
That's great, Cheryl. We can see
That's
it.
great. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so what we're here today to do is talk about the role. So neuronavigation is, in essence, what is it exactly? It is, in fact, it's a collaborative role. So it's designed to support service users with an acquired brain injury after post-injury. It's also another aim is to work with the families and carers and to work with the treating teams across health and social care, including external agencies and organisations to BCUHB. Okay, so I'm now going to kind of look at that in a little bit more detail, if I may. So here we go. Okay. Here we go. So the purpose of the role itself is to improve the opportunities and outcomes for North Wales residents. And it's very much about being able, the role of the neuronavigator is about being able to identify the right place for the right service at the right time to meet the needs of that patient. So it's very much about being as almost a centre point between the patient or the services involved to make sure that the pathway is the correct pathway to meet the needs of that patient and they are able to access the services that they need. Okay. So the role itself, it's about providing continuity. Communication is, I think, one of the biggest parts of this role. So it's about, you are that point of continuity for the service users and family. To me, I think about it as almost being my responsibility, my position is being stood beside that patient and having their view of the world as it would be, to make sure that what they have and what they require and everybody who's involved receive the communication, the information that they need to have for that service user to be able to progress. Okay. Another aspect of the role as well is being able to advise clinicians on appropriate neurorehabilitation pathways. So a common aspect of the role as well is, as we know, following brain injury, one of the most difficult experiences for the service user and also for the families is not only coming to terms with what's happened for that individual, but it's also understanding and navigating what's going on around them and what's going to happen and what's the likely outcomes and where this person's happening in this situation of absolute, what must feel like chaos after injury and not knowing what's going to happen, how that person's going to be in the future. So again, it's a point of communication, it's sharing information, it's making sure that all those services that are required to be are engaged for that patient. So another aspect of the role as well is making sure that the most appropriate services are involved. So that's involved in things, the technicalities of things like making sure that referrals are made, making sure that referrals go to the right services, that referrals are followed through, that the right information shared at the right time to the right people, and seeing that through to the actuality of what happens for that individual, for that person at the centre of all of it. So again, within that, that leads into collaborating with multiple providers and understanding as well. Something that I find is really, I take a great interest, obviously, because ultimately my role is about the patient. I take a great interest in understanding the processes that for the other providers that I work with. So whereas we are, Betsy and I work within the North Wales Brain Injury Service, we're obviously working with services over the border in England, in NHS England, and we're working with private neuro rehab providers as well. So understanding what everyone needs to make this pathway work for the individual, for that patient, in order for them to progress along in their recovery. Okay, so again, this is about facilitating therapy at the right place at the right time. You know, in terms of somebody's pathway from the point of injury, obviously, in the first instance, they need that acute medical care. So we work in partnership with our major trauma centres, which I'm sure you're aware are based at Walton and at the Royal Stoke University Hospital, which I imagine there are some people here today from. So what somebody may need at the point of their injury will not be what they need towards the point of discharge. So it's navigating that pathway and making sure that person is getting the best and optimum support and service provision to optimize their recovery, if you will. Okay, so along with that, another point of my role is monitoring, which is perhaps not the nicest word to use, but there is that point of I stay with that patient, and commonly what I do when I first meet that patient post-injury and I meet their next of kin and their significant others, and I'm walking into that situation, which is a very traumatic time, one of the first things that I explain is that I will stay with you throughout this process. As long as you're in treatment, I will remain with you and I will continue to work with the services around you. And I will ensure through negotiation and through navigating this pathway that you will, as your needs change in your recovery, I will ensure that you again get that right care at the right time in the right place. It goes back to that main point. Okay. Another aspect of my role, which isn't perhaps so interesting, is I ensure that everything is funded. I work with a funding panel as well, and it's part of my role to report to them on the progress. You know, is this person making progress? Are they reaching their goals? Which again, I find really useful because it gives me a bit of a structure. And as I say, it provides a focus that I'm working with a team of people, which include the panel as well as the patient, all the professionals. Okay, so again, another aspect of my role is I work with local area teams to support the patient to return to North Wales. Part of my role as well is it's as I say, I kind of provide that bridge between services, and unfortunately at times for that patient, for that person post-injury to receive that input that they need to receive the service to progress and optimize that recovery, sometimes we have to go over the border. As we know, we work, as I mentioned before, we work with Wales and we work with the Royal University Stoke for acute care. Sometimes as well, we work in partnership with organisations such as BrainKind and other local area teams as well. But ultimately, as I say, my pathway, as I usually do explain to people when I start working with them, is to get them back home, is to get them back to North Wales. Unfortunately, sometimes though, that pathway can have a little bit of a route geographically, but ultimately I'm working to get that person back over the border to North Wales and whatever their home destination is that's most appropriate to them. Okay, so moving on. And with the power of magic and technology. So neuronavigators, just looking at working closely with newbies. So as I say, that I sit with the North Wales Brain Injury Service. And from that position, I'm enabled to navigate the patient pathway with the patient, everyone involved. So just looking at just a nice little picture perhaps of what that looks like. So within the acute setting, and I'm pointing at the screen, and well, acute setting. So what that means for me is I work with those specialist teams. So commonly I link into the District General Hospital. So that's YG, YGC, and Wrexham Myler within that as well. So in the first instance, when somebody's been, as I mentioned about the major trauma centres, when someone goes over the borders, say to Walton or to Stoke, once they've completed their initial acute treatment, I link in with those services and I'm already working at that immediate point post-injury to get that person back to North Wales. So again, I work with specialist teams. I work with those teams within, so when those people can be repatriated, as we call it, over the border, back to us in our district generals. I then go into those medical teams within those district hospitals, again with Nubis and working with the professionals here to advise and support those specialist medical teams. And bearing in mind, as we say, the requirement as it is, the reason that we work with teams geographically in a wider area is because we are tying into those specialties for those neuro rehab and neurological services and bringing them to the patient. So within our services, what we're actually doing within our community hospitals as well, it's not just our district generals, but with the community hospitals and the district generals, even residential services, Nubis are able to bring that neurological expertise to support those medical teams in those acute settings who are not neuro rehab teams, and perhaps yeah, I'll leave that one there. So again, it's also about integrating community services with acute care. So essentially that's bringing again those services into those acute settings and building those bridges ready, creating that pathway for the patient to be discharged from the acutes onto the next step on their pathway. So again, I also support and assist with referrals to specialist units from those acute settings. And what that can mean is for those neuro rehab beds that we refer on to. Excuse me. So regarding the rehabilitation, when we have stepped down from that acute phase back down into when that person's ready to commence on their neuro rehabilitation stage of their recovery, again, I go into attending patient reviews. Again, I monitor progress and advise. I look at that pathway. And I, with my knowledge of local services, again, working with Nubis and with their support and knowledge, part of what I do is try to identify a point as early as possible. You know, can that person, rather than staying perhaps out of area, can we provide that service that's required to meet their needs back at home in North Wales? And again, another aspect of my role in that is actually something that I've enjoyed doing recently is actually approaching and discussing with local services with our support. You know, could you consider taking our North Wales patients following brain injury and providing that step down in our local area instead of that person having to do it further away from home, which can mean being over in England, you know, for that person to be back at home again in that home area and have the opportunity to continue that rehab at home. So again, I assist in coordinating that rehabilitation pathway on discharge, again, linking with referrals, making sure that everybody knows what's going on and that everyone's prepared for that patient with them. So again, just linking that further into the community aspect, I work closely with community rehab services. Another aspect that I do within my role is when somebody, for example, is discharged at home, I can link it with the local services there, even the GP service I've done as well, to make sure there's that seamless transition. Again, it's signposting patients to third sector and charities. I work with Headway. Quite often, one of the first things I say when I meet someone and I meet the family, have you heard of Headway? Do you know about Headway? They're a really good resource, a really good point of contact. And that's one of the things I do. Okay, so again, point of contact, that's why I ask for support for the family members as well. And bringing the expertise, neuropsychological expertise of Nubis into that, perhaps doing family support sessions and such like. And it's also, my role is about advocating for the patient to reaccess local or specialist services if appropriate. So again, it's working with those home area local services. It might be the CMHT, it might be those services, and providing them with the support and access to kind of clinical information regarding that person's brain injury and what they need to give them the confidence to work with that to work with that person as their local area home team and enable them to link in with the services they need in their local home area. Okay. So moving on. So what is it? The patient experience. So I was looking at this as just a little bit of a picture perhaps for a person that I worked with. Okay, so this person, just running through this, was admitted to a district general surgical ward following a road traffic accident and acute medical care in England, as we mentioned, on major trauma centres. Through there, they were then referred to North Wales Brain Injury Service and accepted for the neuronavigation service. I, as neuronavigator, working with the neuropsychologist for NUBIS, North Wales Brain Injury Service, we engaged with ward and the medical teams to support the patient and family during their admission. I then collaborated with the patient, the family and inpatient teams, community health teams, and GP practice during that discharge back to home. Okay. And ultimately, this person was discharged home with the support of our team and the North Wales Brain Injury team with the local area community health team. So, as I say, everything went to plan to the benefit of that person post-injury. So what does the future hold for our service? So for the neuronavigation service, as Sophie mentioned, she was the clinical lead and I am the first neuronavigator. We look forward to learning from those with lived experience, and we strive to provide the service and support that meets the needs of the person. We are nothing if we are not meeting the needs of that individual post-injury. So again, we look forward to achieving that. We are actively developing this. This is still very much a new service, and we are very much still in the development stage. And we are actively gathering feedback from all parties to inform our future development and being able to improve our service to what's required. We look forward to developing and strengthening our relationships with all our stakeholders, existing and creating new, and that's including the patient, the family, NHS providers, private providers. We manufacture, we support and develop that pathway for that patient. And finally, as I mentioned before, we look forward to welcoming a second neuronavigator in the new year and being able to further expand the abilities of the service to ever more and ever better support the needs of that person post-injury. Okay. And that's me. Thank you very much, Diog. Can I ask, are there any questions if we have time for, or shall we move on?
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Cheryl. We really appreciate that fascinating insight into what is a new role. And I just guess one thing that I just wanted to add for people who aren't maybe aware, because I know there's people from outside of Wales listening today, that this was sort of born out of us not having that very specialist inpatient neuro rehab within North Wales. And it's always that balance, isn't it, Cheryl, between people receiving that specialist input, but also potentially being quite a long way away from their families. So it's that balance between receiving that input, but also knowing how important it is to have your community and have your families around you for your own well-being and your recovery. And I know one of the things that we hear time and time again is how useful it is having that person of contact, having you, Cheryl, like you said, across that journey to help people understand the different options and what's important to consider when making those decisions. Because like I said earlier on, we're not all born experts in this stuff, and often it's a very sudden experience that leads families to be trying to navigate this. So as you said, it is a work in progress, but we've certainly had lots of good feedback so far, which is fantastic. There are a few questions popping up in the comments, Cheryl. There's one around, so somebody's written here, do you find a breakdown of communication is common? So for example, between service providers, particularly in individuals who live in more rural areas.
I think there's a risk of that, and that's something that I'm extremely conscious of. And as I tried to kind of touch on before, I think it's what if I could envisage what I do is a picture in my mind. What I do, it's kind of like we start from that point of injury, and it's almost I view myself as a bridge. I level the pathway for that person. For that person post-injury and for the family working with them as well. So what I actually do is provide the link between the services and then bring those services in. So I communicate with all the services, I level that pathway and ensure that each with each service, I have a discussion about what they need and what we need to progress that pathway onto the next step. So to me, it's almost like that leveling and smoothing of the pathway. So yes, there is a risk, but that's what I'm here for. And to me, that's the purpose of my role. So I can't say that I achieve that errorlessly. It is still work in progress. I'm learning all the time. As I say, I'm not an expert in my own right. I have the wonderful ability to draw on the skills and knowledge of my colleagues that knew this. But again, Headway as well. So it is very much very early days, and it is very much I learn from every experience. I learn from the lived experience of every individual that I work with. So it can only ever continue to improve and evolve.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cheryl.
You're welcome.
We've just got time for just a couple more, and there's a question that I can answer about funding. And yes, this is from Joe. This is an NHS funded role, and it's a permanent position, and we are delighted to have you as part of our team, Cheryl. And there was a question about how long this role has been in place, and it was earlier this year. Cheryl, was it April?
Yes.
Fantastic. So only since April. So it's still, like I said, it's very much in its infancy. Okay, so that's fantastic. So there are a couple more comments on the chat, and I think, Cheryl, between you and I, we can maybe respond to those in the chats a little bit later on, because as I'm aware, part of my role is keeping us to time, so we will move on to the next speaker. But thank you again, Cheryl, for your fascinating talk. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so where are we next? So as we have shifted our agenda around today, so our final speaker is Dr. Rudy Koitzer, who I believe, I can see your picture on the screen, has joined us. I'm aware that it says Sophie Perry underneath your picture, Rudy, just to make you aware there aren't two Sophies here today. Okay.
I'm very happy to be you, Sophie.
Thank you. Right then, so it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Rudy Koitzer, consultant clinical neuropsychologist, clinical director at BrainKind, and honorary professor at Bangor and Swansea universities. Of course, many of you here will know that Rudy founded the North Wales Brain Injury Service, and as long as I've done my maths correctly, I believe it was in 1998. And he spent 23 years leading and growing the service before moving to his current role within BrainKind. And Rudy is going to be talking to us today about an important clinical issue and growing area of research around loneliness after brain injury.
So I'm so sorry for the hassle, but as they say, every setback has something positive in it. I got home very, very late last night. It's been a totally chaotic day, so bear with me. So that's the bad news. The good news is that I'm talking about loneliness. So this tech setback that I've had, in a funny way, brought me back to friends. So I'm on site. So it's reduced my social isolation from being alone at home today and being here amongst my old colleagues, which is fantastic. So I'm going to talk about loneliness and social isolation today. As Sophie said, I'm back with friends. I'm on site. It's lovely to be here. I worked in the NHS for a long time. I love the NHS. Who doesn't love the NHS? It was a fantastic chapter in my life. And I learned a lot, including about social isolation and loneliness, which is the topic I would like to talk about today. So I'll start off with just looking at loneliness and social isolation from three angles. The first is that if we look at a more philosophical side, it's fair to say that you can almost equate loneliness to a terrible poverty, the feeling of not being wanted, to being out on your own with nobody around you is a terrible thing. And I think many people, probably many of us, have experienced that as well. There are times where we've been intensely lonely and without friends and social connections, and that really, really hurts. I think if we add the second angle to that, and we try and put ourselves into the worlds of our patients, a more phenomenological as opposed to the philosophical angle, then that adds another layer, doesn't it? So this is somebody I used to see back in the days who sustained a severe traumatic brain injury. For those of the us who are academics or clinicians who might be interested in the scan, all that scan shows is really tight sulci and gyri, which is generalized cerebral swelling. Which is what is much more interesting is what's on the left. And this person explained to me very beautifully at the end of a session what it was like to sustain a brain injury and what rehabilitation was like, which we shouldn't underestimate. He said to me, this young lad in his 30s, it was as if someone dropped me in the ocean near New Zealand. I had to swim back to the UK. It was exhausting. It took 2 years. When I finally arrived home, nobody understood me. And he very beautifully explained where in North Wales. It was off the Llyn Peninsula, a little beach he described there. That's where he finally got back to in this metaphor. But then the really terrible thing he said is gradually all his friends, this was a very sociable lad in his 30s, all his friends fell away. He used to play football, nobody was interested in him. He made a fabulous physical recovery. Looked like there was nothing wrong with him, but the changes in his social and interpersonal behavior meant that gradually everybody fell away and he became very, very lonely, intensely lonely. The third angle is we learned a lot during the pandemic. I think, again, as a clinician, it was really striking during that time to see the loneliness that patients experienced. Families couldn't visit them. At best, you could see families through the window. It's not great being in a hospital, but to add social isolation with no visitors to that, and then to add all the layers of PPE and plastic and what else we are to wear, that you're not even able to see another human being properly or touch them. Which in this paper, there are many studies about loneliness in the pandemic. This one is highly relevant to us as neurorehabilitation professionals, is that the pandemic exponentially increased loneliness, in that it was very difficult for people to access anything in the community. And I guess that the hypothesis that I will put out there is that even when pandemic is supposedly over, but I think it left its marks in that people became fearful to go out and became even more isolated. Okay, so let's move on. So as I said, I worked in the NHS for a very, very long time. In the summer of 2021, I left the NHS and started a role with BrainKind, which is the largest independent provider of neurorehabilitation in the UK. Now that's our new hospital in York, which has just been finished, where we take patients who have mental health comorbidities with brain injury. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our rehabilitation model because it's relevant for the topic we're talking about today. So our model is a neurobehavioral model with a very big emphasis on therapeutic intervention to reduce social disability. It's one model with 3 streams. What that means is that there are different stages after brain injury. There's the acute life-saving stage, there's a subacute stage, there's the middle stage, and then there's the very long-term journey. One of my frustrations in the NHS was that the NHS is excellent at acute and subacute care, but what happens to patients longer term is sometimes a bit of a mystery and a bit of a lottery. Now, we were very, very lucky in the North Wales Brain Injury Service, and the North Wales Brain Injury Service continues to thrive even more than it ever has, in that the service does follow people up longer term, but that's not the universal picture in the UK. So our model tries to, for those people on the more severe end of the spectrum, to provide a pathway across the whole journey from acute all the way to the long-term outcomes. And key to that is the problem of social behavior, which can change, meaning that sometimes there are subtle behavioral and other changes which can make people lose their friends and their connections and become really isolated. The model is very simple. Most people will recognize it. It's the three parts of the pathway: restoration, compensation, support, and relapse prevention. So restoration is the early stages where I guess more is better, where neuroplasticity lends itself to restoration of functions. And that's very early post-injury, and some of our hospitals and rehab units are configured and staffed to provide that. After that comes a stage in most people's journey where spontaneous recovery has run its course and more won't be better. In fact, it might just create frustrations. And that's a stage where we try to find better ways to work around lost functionality. And we all use it anyway. So, for example, most of us have a calendar or some reminders on our phones, or we use sat-nav. There are ways to work around things that we're not so great at naturally. So this is the approach then. And then the long term, sometimes we have to, I think, acknowledge and realize that despite our best efforts, somebody is not going to make a recovery which enables them to return to employment and maybe integrate to society as they would love to. And that's more a home for life, relapse prevention type of model. The actual procedures we use is also probably very familiar to people. Reinforcement, meaning praise, modeling, and I want to emphasize the modeling because that's at the heart of the model as well, and that includes social behavior. So people are in our units or in our hospitals, and there are other people around. There are frontline support workers who constantly model and reinforce behavior, including pro-social or helpful social behavior to make connections again. That can be reinforced by feedback, or less desirable behaviors can be non-reinforced. Central to this is every interaction is an opportunity to implement rehab. And that means that in a traditional clinical model or clinic model where somebody's followed up once a week, there's 7 other days where nothing happens. So this model incorporates that everything where somebody's in the passage, everything everywhere is an opportunity to reinforce or praise behavior. And that is to promote the learning, to consolidate, to generalize new or lost, including specifically social behaviors. So to praise someone and to reinforce that and to non-reinforce behaviors that will isolate them and lead to loneliness. And that's across different environments. But the £1 million question is this a good model? I think a recent study we published says that it is, meaning that using different ways to look at your outcomes. So traditionally what we do is we look at outcomes by comparing ourselves to ourselves. So we look at outcome data compared to last year, compared to the year before. What we've done here is something called benchmarking, is to compare to ourselves, but also compare to external UK publicly available outcome data in published papers, which have already been through peer review. What that means metaphorically is that if we want to see if we're good at something, including rehabilitation in this case, it's good to look in the mirror. That's a good approach. But you may miss things. So there's a lot to be said for looking outside of the window to see how other providers are doing and see if you're comparable. And this study shows that we are at least as effective as other rehab providers, but perhaps in a shorter period of time, which is important for society in terms of cost. benefits. And for patients, of course, who do not want to stay forever in a unit. Which brings us nicely to why is loneliness important? So I've spoken about the philosophical, phenomenological, and the pandemic angle, but is that convincing enough about why this is important, or is it just the research and a clinical interest of my own, which doesn't have that much relevance? So why is it important? Loneliness is bad for your health. This is in a neurotypical population. So if we don't factor in brain injury, if we look at a population who've not had an acquired brain injury, loneliness is bad for your health. What does that mean? So that means that loneliness, not having friends, not having family, not having connections, the first point is very intuitive and perhaps obvious, is that that's not great for your mental health and is a big risk factor for depression. The other findings from this publication, which I find very interesting, is that it's bad for your cardiometabolic health. What that means is it's bad for your heart and it's bad for things like diabetes and other health conditions. Now, it might be that that's a proxy, meaning that if you are isolated and lonely, that you not engage with anything, that you don't move around enough, or that you don't get out, or that you form poor dietary habits. Whatever the case may be, it's not great for you. The other bit that's probably even more interesting is that loneliness is a predictor and a marker for cognitive functioning. What that means is that being socially isolated, not interacting with people, is potentially a risk factor for mild cognitive impairment and dementia. So it is hugely relevant. What I would say, I think that might be, is that if we stand back and we look at social interaction, speaking with other people, interacting with people, being friends with people, loving those close to us, is actually very, very complex in terms of brain functioning. It's certainly much more complex than remembering a 15-word list. And I do wonder if that part is not used, if we go back to Hebbian learning, use it or lose it, that this is fairly logically a marker for cognitive problems later on, in that you don't engage with those very, very high level cognitive functions of interacting with other human beings. The last one, again, is seems very simple. Loneliness is poor, is not good for sleep. It's poor for your sleep, and sleep is a very significant biomarker for health problems. Poor sleep equates health problems. Why is loneliness important then for neuro rehab? Hopefully that's a convincing case that loneliness is hugely important for society as a whole. Some colleagues here, ex-colleagues of the service, Chris in particular, did a fabulous study on stroke and loneliness, looking at big data. And again, the unequivocal finding is that stroke is a marker for social isolation and loneliness. Here's another study from the United States. Traumatic brain injury and loneliness, increased incidence and prevalence of loneliness after that. So we know that from these that research shows that loneliness increases after brain injury, and that should be fairly intuitive as well. But what does loneliness and social isolation mean? I've been using that very loosely now, and perhaps this trying to be a little bit of an academic. What does it mean? It means different things to different people. So let's look at this. That looks like somebody who's lonely, doesn't it? Do you know what? There could be several lonely people in that crowd as well. So if we go back, that seems obviously lonely. But I'm sure there's lonely people in that crowd as well. I'll explain. This is social isolation. This actually reminds me of the Denby Moors, where you see a house in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and you wonder who lives there and how connected they are, and so forth. I think this is in Scotland, to be fair. So social isolation, somebody lives far away, but you could also be quite close and proximal to other people and be socially isolated. So we go to inner city areas, you find people in high-rise buildings we ever so often read about somebody who's passed away and their body was discovered 12 months or 18 months later, and you think how absolutely isolated must they have been. So you can also be isolated amongst other people. So let's see. So loneliness is how I feel. So if I say I feel lonely, I feel that, you know, nobody cares about me, I'm alone. That's subjective. That's a feeling. That's quite a visceral thing. So I can be extremely lonely in a crowd. I can be amongst many people, but feel disconnected from them and lonely, no friends, and or be lonely on my own. Whereas social isolation is much more objective, and we can measure social isolation. So social isolation, a simple way to explain it is how many times you see friends and family per week. So it's the number of contacts per week. But it can also be environmental, and I think that's particularly salient to North Wales in that it is a rural area. And it was, again, my colleagues at Newbis will know this, when we went out to do home visits during the pandemic, you would find somebody who's not seen a soul for weeks, if not months, never mind a health professional, completely isolated. But it could also be due to a lack of social connection. So again, you can be isolated even on a campus, in that you live somewhere in the halls, but you have no social connections. If you put those two things together, there are people who are alone but perfectly happy with that. They might be, you know, very independently minded or introverts. But just for the conceptualization, so loneliness is how you feel and isolation is how frequent. Now, if we add brain injury to this whole mix, then it becomes, I think, more interesting. So I have always been struck by people I've seen that they describe, or we might assess them in that they're different. There's been a change since the injury. And in contrast to that, the things they describe are invisible. So if they walk down the street, so if I walk down the street, if I go back to that crowd, there might well be several people in there with a brain injury, but I wouldn't know that. Whereas if somebody had lost both their legs, I would certainly know that, and I'd probably give up my seat for them on the tube. So that makes it really tricky in that somebody's different. They might have been very socially connected, but now being different, that's also invisible. So those around them might not understand. And that's one of the drivers how people can become lonely and then isolated. So let me give you an example to make it a little bit more tangible. Somebody I saw, a female of 25 years old, who was living with a parent. So this already a little bit unusual in that, you know, most people of 25 would have moved out already, was referred by a general practitioner. This is this lady's acute scan, which again shows a tight sulci gyri and an enormous hematoma on the right, which will be the left of your screen. Hematoma as in an egg if somebody's fallen on the head. It discharged from the life-saving care after a week, struggled, lost friends, loss of independence, and then eventually at the age of 25 came to our attention through a referral. So there's 7 years of struggling alone and being isolated and things just unraveling. The things she told me, she wanted to know what happened. Will I remember? Why did it happen? These are more existential questions, which as a scientist, I don't know the answers to. I don't know why bad things happen to people. The relevant thing here is all my friends have moved on. This is a young person who's lost all her friends and then starts to ruminate, what will become of me? Will I forever be on my own? Will I be lonely forever? Will I work again? So in the community rehabilitation, there are a few things that were achieved and a few things that failed. We often try to get people to college, and that failed. And I think because of the altered social skills, the person just couldn't reconnect to that peer group at all. In fact, she described very sadly to me how everybody had moved on. They had boyfriends, partners, and eventually, you know, the story got, and they've got children and so forth. With occupational therapy input, she did return to work, which was fantastic. That connected her. And the next thing, the driving test, seems like a small thing, but she was terrified of driving. She sustained her injury in a car accident. But you can't really connect that easily to people if you can't drive in North Wales. The public transport is a bit hit and miss. So that was an important thing which unlocked the ability to travel and more independence. And an interesting thing, so she spontaneously booked herself in to see me many, many years later. And I thought maybe it's a, you know, setback or something. And she came to tell me that she had settled with someone and that things worked out fine in the end. And I think those small things about that we can, on a functional level, achieve for patients can reduce their isolation. I will conclude with looking at, I think, if I remember correctly, 3 research areas. The first one is technology. So this is very relevant today. So technology created a barrier for me today, but in a funny way. It was a blessing because it's actually really nice to be on site. So I want to talk very, very briefly about the use of social media, loneliness and isolation. I became interested in this, I guess, during the pandemic, in that would social media help to reconnect people and reduce their loneliness and isolation if they can't physically see other people? And a huge thank you to the local Headway colleagues who, without them, this study would not have been possible. So what we found, and this study was done through a local Headway branch, a survey, and we found that there's increased loneliness after brain injury in North Wales, unsurprisingly. But look at this. If you really want to see a stark statistic, if you look at the second point, so the national survey for people who've not had a brain injury in Wales, the national survey looking at thousands of people and using the same items we used in our survey, found that 15% of the people, the general population, report or endorse enough items to be classified as profoundly lonely and isolated. Whereas our study showed almost 64%. That's really stark, how brain injury can isolate you. If ever there was a statistic, this is it. Next one is probably self-explanatory. We did find that the older you get, the less you use technology or less you engage with it. For some, and I suppose my generation, our technology is pencil and paper. But there was no association between use of tech and social media and loneliness, and that's an interesting one. And I think, having thought about this a lot, in that technology is a double-edged sword, isn't it? People get tormented on social media. That's the one problem. Second problem, which explored in a book chapter fairly recently, is that 99.9% of tech is actually quite flaky. So if you go beyond WhatsApp, Google, and say Instagram, a lot of tech actually fails and doesn't help to connect people. But the big thing is that technology, whilst really great to reconnect you, is actually not a replacement for having contact with other people in a more traditional sense, where you hang out with other people, you with friends or with family. So it's fabulous to back up times when we travel or when we are away, but it can't replace human contact really. And again, to go back to the pandemic, I've never in my life seen so many people who simply wanted to just come sit by the bed, talk with me. Can I touch you? I can't tell you how many times I've heard that in a ward. Can I touch you? Because nobody had been in contact with anybody in that time. Next study is something called social peer mentoring, which I found interesting. This is where It was a randomized controlled trial of sorts. I'll say why I say that. In that 18 people with 12 people with a traumatic brain injury were matched with social peer mentors, and 18 were on waiting lists. And what this intervention did was basically a psychoeducation, similar to what many services do, for example, in NUBIS as well, is to help people how to build skills, to plan, and then to have a joint activity in the community for 3 months duration. What the study found is that people loved the intervention, they were very satisfied with it, but there was no increase in the number of contacts or activities. And I guess the thing there to watch out for, the number there, this was only 3 months. And I think for new behavior to settle down, which is the beauty of the NUBIS model, and the beauty of Headway, in that Headway and NUBIS goes the full journey with you. You can't fix things in 3 months. And I think that's a valuable lesson from this study, which in contrast to this one, which is a Finnish study, and I'm sure I recognize some of my Finnish colleagues. Yes, I do. And this is a long-term study, as the Nordic countries tend to do. So this is a 20-year study in contrast to 3 months. Groups on social communication skills. So this really cuts to the heart of the problem, in that it's social communication. It's not the problem that you have with a limb that doesn't work or your memory. It's those speaking without a filter moments, being impulsive, being disinhibited. And also the third point there is affective communication. And I guess a simple metaphor or synonym for that would be empathy, the ability to show compassion to another person, to put yourself in their shoes, which is the oil that really makes social communication works and relationships work. If you can't put yourself in somebody else's shoes, you can't have compassion with them. It's going to be very difficult forming a relationship with them. And that was practiced. And that, I mean, that's a 20-year study, so that had really good outcomes. And with that, I'll conclude. I just want to, I started with philosophy, and I guess the older you get, the more interested you become in philosophy and other sources of insight. And I do think that, of course, I will say this as an academic, that social isolation and loneliness is important, and hopefully as a clinician, I would have had the experience to see that that's true at an experiential level as well. There's something about this point made by Mahatma Gandhi, is that with every true friendship, we build more firmly the foundations on which the peace of the whole world actually rests. Okay, so thanks very much. I
think that's a really important point to end on. Thank you again, Rudy. We really appreciate your talk today. It was fantastic. So that marks the end of this year's conference. So all that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to all of our speakers and for everyone who has taken the time to join us this morning. It really has been fascinating to hear about the lived experience of a family navigating life after brain injury, alongside current research, innovation within local services, and the ongoing work that Headway are doing to raise awareness. So diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you so much to all who have contributed. I also just wanted to say a special thank you to Fionn Jones from Headway and Dr. Catherine Roberts, who work tirelessly to make this conference happen each year, and also to Dr. Rachel Williams for her behind-the-scenes support today. Thank you to everyone on the conference committee and Slater and Gordon lawyers whose sponsorship make this conference possible. And I think, Fionn, do you have a slide for the evaluation? Okay, fantastic, thank you. So on the screen now, you can see a QR code to access our feedback form. We genuinely really value your feedback and look at it carefully each year to help improve future conferences. Although it's disappeared, hopefully it'll come back. So if you are able to take a few minutes to complete it for us, we would be so grateful. If, like me, QR codes have escaped you, Fionn will also send out a link via email to the form with the recording of today's session. You have to be quick to get this QR code. Okay. Fantastic. So finally, it's my last job of this morning to pass you over to Luke Griggs, Chief Executive from Headway UK, for some closing remarks. So Luke.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And I just want to basically to have a few quick words, quick words at the end, just to sum up my feelings from what I found is really engaging virtual conference, and some really fascinating presentations. And I think we've been really honoured to have some such expertise being shared with us today. So just to reiterate my thanks to all of the speakers for sharing all their knowledge and thoughts with us today. I'd particularly like to thank Margaret, because I'm fully aware of that we as people who work in the field of brain injury can talk about it as much as we like, but the reality is the personal testimony is so much more powerful. That lived experience, and do not underestimate the strength of character it takes to actually be willing to share your experiences of brain injury with strangers in such a format and sharing the most intimate details of your life. And you know, my heartfelt thanks to you, Margaret, for doing that, because it really brings it home to us about what the real impact of brain injury can be. What we've also learned today, I think, is the value of collaborations and connectivity, whether that is individuals through loneliness or through the work of Headway network, and just making sure people realise that they are not in this on their own, but also that connectivity and the collaboration between organisations. And you know, certainly the work of the North Wales Brain Injury Service and that connection with Headway has been so beneficial to both those organisations. And you know, my congratulations to that service for 25th anniversary, which is wonderful, and just keep up the good work. So thank you so much for that. And speaking of connectivity and collaborations, there's a good opportunity for me to just get a little plug in myself, because at the moment Headway UK is developing its new long-term strategy. And we really want to hear the voices of people who are directly affected by brain injury, who work in the field of brain injury. So we're asking people to share their thoughts and help us to shape the next direction of Headway. The world has changed so much since COVID. We're trying to change with it. It's an exciting new time for Headway as we look to evolve the work we do on a UK-wide basis, but also on a local level as well. So there are some brief surveys available on our website for different perspectives of brain injury, whether you're a carer, whether you're a brain injury survivor, whether you're a professional. Please do take a look. They're on our social media channels as well. So please help us to get some new ideas about how we can shape the future. So again, thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to our sponsors, Slater and Gordon. And thank you all for listening today. I really hope it's been bit of interest. And again, to reiterate my thanks to my colleagues Fionn and to Sam for all the background work they did to put this together. So thank you all. I would, at this point of our conference, wish you all a safe journey home. I think we can safely skip that one on this occasion, but thank you again, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Take care.